Everyone. We'll just start by introducing ourselves. I'm Tom Mattei. I live in New York City, where I attend Redeemer Presbyterian Church, West Side. I've worked in government research and the NGO level on issues related to environment and health concerning air pollution and climate. And I'm really pleased to be with you here this evening, and I appreciate your taking your Sunday evening to join us.
I'm Curtis Baysinger. I'm an elder at Westminster Presbyterian in Nashville. I'm the chair of our Earth Care Committee, and I'm also connected with Presbyterians for Carbon Dividends, which is part of, we have a partnership with Presbyterians for Earth Care, and I'm a retired physician, interested in climate change and healthcare and other things beyond that. So, thanks.
My name is Linda Racine. I'm an elder with the Presbyterian Church of Traverse City, Michigan, and co-chair of the Presbyterians for Carbon Dividend. My career's been in education, and I think I've been passionate about creation care since I was 6 and planted my first garden. So, in progress. Looking forward to tonight's discussion and learning with all of you. Go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, so before we jump into our agenda, I want to acknowledge we're going to be talking about carbon fee and dividend, but we, and probably many of you, recognize that there's no single policy that's sufficient to solve the climate change problem or to repair the harms of social, racial, and economic injustice in our country. And we also are aware that there are good reasons for many in the faith and environmental community to have some skepticism about market-based environmental solutions. So, Linda, maybe you could pop up the first slide then, and we'll jump in. So as we work through this agenda, we'll try to speak to some of these concerns and discuss them with you. We're going to pause for questions about 2/3 of the way through and at the end. But if you have questions that come up along the way, please place them in the chat, and we'll try to get to as many as we possibly can. So I'm going to start by reviewing the global scope and urgency of the climate crisis. You're then going to hear from Curtis, who's going to consider different policy approaches for reducing greenhouse gas emissions and their pros and cons. And Linda will explain why we believe that a carbon fee and dividend should be a key part of any mix of policy solutions and how it would work. And then after some Q&A, we're going to share some ideas for actions you can take to support carbon fee and dividend if you believe in it, and other complementary policies that may be important to you, but not addressed in carbon fee and dividend. Next slide, please. So I'm going to look at 2 very closely linked global health crises of climate change and air pollution. And I'm going to look at that with a national, a local New York City lens where I live, and also a global lens. Next slide, please. So this graphic is taken from the journal Lancet, and it shows many pathways that connect climate change to health.
Just be quiet now.
Hello? Everyone hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Everybody should mute except the speakers.
Yeah. Thank you. So greenhouse gas emissions from fossil fuels and other sources, of course, affect the global climate, and the local impacts come from things like heat, flooding, drought, and fire that all affect health in many different ways. Now, hot weather and fires can worsen local air pollution, as we're seeing this year, but an even more important link between air quality and health is from the co-pollutants like PM 2.5 or fine particles, and the precursors of ozone that are emitted whenever fossil fuels are burned. This pathway is shown wrapping around the far right side of this graphic. The graphic also shows that how much climate change impacts people depends a lot on these social mediating factors like poverty, which are shown in green. So the poorest countries and the most disadvantaged people within countries are much more exposed. They tend to be more susceptible to harm, and they have less resources to cope with the effects of climate change and air pollution. Next slide, please, Linda. So awareness of air pollution effects on lung health, like asthma in children, are well recognized and often in the news. But it's important to remember that air pollution, pollutants like PM 2.5 affect nearly every part of the body. The harm begins even before birth from exposures of women during pregnancy, and it continues straight across the whole lifespan. Most air pollution and deaths in adults, in fact, are from heart disease like strokes and heart attacks, but also chronic lung disease and lung cancer. In young children, air pollution not only causes fatal pneumonia and asthma, but by decreasing birth weight and lung growth, as well as cognitive development, it causes harm to the future health and life potential of children as they grow up. Next slide, please. So let's look at the impact at the national level, and we'll focus on just air pollution and one effect of climate, which is high temperature, which is the deadliest one in this country. So according to the Global Burden of Disease Study, it's estimated that about 60,000 deaths per year are caused by air pollution, and high temperature caused about 2,400 deaths per year in the United States. So when you see these numbers in the news or in presentations like the one I'm giving, you sometimes you can get confused by the variation, different estimates, they change over time. And one reason for that is that the science is evolving, and pretty much the more we study air pollution and heat and other climate exposures, the more dangerous we learn they are, and that there are effects of air pollution, for example, at very low levels across the world. It's also important to recognize that the deaths, which are often the headline number, are really just the tip of the iceberg of the harm from air pollution and from climate. So there's many more non-fatal serious illnesses for each death that occurs. There are also more subtle but very important effects like missing school days and the ability to learn, and productivity in the workforce. And then, as I mentioned, very important are these lifelong effects from how air pollution and climate can affect birth outcomes and young children. Next slide, please. So now zooming into a particular city where I live and where I've worked for some time on these issues, if we look at the issue of heat exposure, which in New York City and pretty much for much of the US, heat waves are on average the deadliest type of extreme weather that we face. But what we see in New York, and it's true elsewhere, is that some people and some communities are much greater risk of severe illness or death during a heat wave. So in New York, where we see an overlap of social disadvantage, like people who are living in poverty, non-Hispanic Black populations in communities, where those social disadvantage factors overlay or are coincident with physical environment factors like higher surface temperature and less vegetative cover, where those social and physical environment factors overlap, the chance that people will die during an extreme heat event are much greater. If we look at the household level, an important risk factor is what we call energy insecurity. And that means energy insecurity means, among other things, struggling to pay energy bills. And in this particular case, it means that people are unable to pay the electric bill to run their air conditioner, or may not be able to afford an air conditioner or an efficient one. Next slide, please. So if we look at air pollution, many of us, we're familiar with the idea that there are frontline communities where fossil fuels are produced, but there are also frontline communities where fossil fuels are used, especially for transportation. So in New York City, studies have shown that the contribution of PM 2.5 emissions from trucks and buses that have diesel engines, much more polluting than gasoline engines typically. Those levels are 70% higher in our high poverty neighborhoods. And I apologize, showing these maps of New York City may not mean much to people who haven't been here or familiar, but the sort of long, thin island is Manhattan, and the northern part of Manhattan includes neighborhoods like Harlem and Washington Heights. And then just to the right of that is the South Bronx, and those are high poverty neighborhoods. One reason for these higher emissions are things like interstates that cut through the heart of the South Bronx and really inner city neighborhoods across the country during racially unjust urban renewal projects. So these higher exposures to traffic pollution, when they occur in the same neighborhoods where people already have a higher burden of disease from things like diabetes and asthma, the risk of death or serious illness from air pollution is greatly increased in high poverty neighborhoods. And I should also mention those same parts of New York were most impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic, as was true in much of the country. Next slide, please, Linda. So now if we zoom the camera out to the global level, and we look at the health impacts of air pollution and heat exposure, globally, there's really a shockingly serious impact from air pollution, between 6 and 7 million deaths per year. And that actually well exceeds the deaths that are caused today by unsafe drinking water, just to give one example. The greatest share of these deaths, the lion's share, is in low and middle income countries where the air is much more polluted than in wealthy countries like ours. So if you look over on the right, you can see in the low and middle income countries, the levels, the annual average PM 2.5 levels are more than 5 times what we typically see in the US. And that's largely because we've benefited from decades of declining air pollution following the implementation of the Clean Air Act and related regulations since 1970. So for heat also, there's a big impact globally, about 300,000 deaths per year, and 95% of these come outside of the more affluent parts of the world. Harder to quantify, but very serious are effects of things like drought, food insecurity, and violent conflict that are also greatest in the poorest parts of the world. Next slide, please. So climate change is very closely linked to energy production and use, of course. And if you look across countries, this is showing per capita energy consumption on the horizontal axis and life expectancy on the vertical axis. You can see that higher energy consumption is associated with longer life expectancy up to a point. So in low-income countries, like you see in the steep part of the curve on the left, as people get more access to energy, it supports services that are essential for health, like heat, cooking in a clean way, lighting, refrigeration, hot water, cooling, modern healthcare, and transportation of food, other goods, and services. But here in the US, we're on kind of the diminishing returns part of this curve. And in fact, some of our energy use even is harmful to health. For example, we use a lot of energy in increasingly longer and sedentary commutes in private automobiles. That contributes to the national obesity epidemic, and it's causing traffic safety issues for pedestrians that I'll talk about later in this session. So while many developing economies must and will increase energy consumption in ways that are good for health, shown in the green arrow, we can and must shrink our average energy consumption through efficiencies and behavior change in ways that can actually make us healthier. Next slide, please. So the rapid rise in energy consumption globally in developing economies, it's come in part as billions of people have been lifted out of poverty due to global trade and development. This is good, but at the same time, we in America and other high-income countries consume large quantities of imported goods, from places with less stringent environmental and labor protections. So you can see, just as an example, how emissions surged with China's economic boom, which started around the time it joined the World Trade Organization in 2001. And now China is beginning to decarbonize energy use and flatten the curve of carbon emissions. So with today, the USA accounting for about 15% of global emissions and a share that's shrinking, the carbon intensity of energy production needs to go down quickly here and everywhere, including in our trading partners. Next slide, please. So in the news recently has been an IPCC report that you see in the top on the right side. But there was also another report, got less press, but I think it's also important, global warming of 1.5 degrees C. And these two reports together lay out certain physical science realities. The first is not news, probably to any of you, which is climate change worsened by human influences here. It's harmful to people everywhere, and it will worsen. How much it worsens and how much we limit future warming depends not only on when we get to net zero, which is what gets a lot of attention by politicians and in the news, but how fast we reduce emissions in the near term. And that's because if we are slow, we're using up the remaining what's called the carbon budget. Also, the IPCC says that in the US and other high-income countries, reducing energy consumption and energy demand will increase the chances of global success, and it will limit the need for solutions that are unproven or have other risks like carbon capture and storage, for example. Next slide. So reducing emissions at speed and at global scale requires systemic change, and that means policy support. Next slide. So as I said earlier, we're facing a large, complex crisis with no single solution. But we believe that the global climate crisis calls for solutions that meet at least three requirements. First, as a Christian community, we are called to care for creation in ways that center social justice and advances human flourishing, especially for our poorest and most vulnerable neighbors, whether they're in our own community, in our country, or around the world. So with climate change, we seek solutions that are socially just and work to undo at least some of the unfair burdens that are created by how we generate, use, and pay for energy. Second, justice for today's children and future generations requires the fast emission reductions that the physical science tells us are needed. And that to achieve these, we need to use evidence-based approaches that include reducing energy consumption in wealthy countries. Third, solutions with global effects are needed, not only because that's what really matters to the global climate system, but because the world's poorest countries and poorest peoples are most impacted by air pollution caused by fossil fuel use and by climate change. Next slide. So now I think I'm going to turn it over to Curtis, who will speak to what governments can do.
Thanks a lot, Tom. And I'm going to consider now over the next 10 minutes what government can do and what we as individuals and what our denomination and as what we as people of faith can do in order to deal with this evolving catastrophe. Next slide, please, Linda. So we're going to examine what government can do. And in effect, government has three ways that can alter societal behavior. It can spend money in various ways on research, development, infrastructure, and are providing us incentives on behavior it would like its population to engage in. It can pass laws or have agencies set up regulations, and it can tax undesirable behavior. So let's consider these separate things and how they meet the solution requirements that Tom outlined just about a minute ago. That it's fast, effective, it's socially just, and has global effects. Next slide, please. So government can spend money on research and development. And there's no question that this is going to be necessary because many technologies have not been developed that are going to be required for us to get to net zero and to decarbonize our society. We're going to have to decarbonize transportation. We're going to have to find a way to store energy that from renewables better. And we're going to have to eliminate methane and capture it better than we have in the past. Next slide, please. We're also going to have to deal with agriculture. And in this past Congress, we have signed a bipartisan bill that deals with the effects of agriculture and allows farmers to go ahead and use more regenerative techniques that are going to reduce global emissions. This is important because agriculture constitutes about 10 to 12% of all the greenhouse gases emitted in our country. Next slide, please. Government is going to have to provide infrastructure support. We're going to have to build out our grid so that we can accommodate more renewable energy. And we're going to have to provide charging stations, which will require infrastructure development. Next slide, please. Finally, because we're going to have to deal with the effects of climate and carbon emissions that has already occurred, we're going to have to give money to infrastructure hardening, particularly in minority communities that are going to be most at risk. We're going to have to provide resilience to coastal areas that are going to have to accommodate greater sea rise. Next slide, please. And then finally, government can provide us with incentives that will alter our own individual behavior. For example, tax incentives for us to put solar panels on our roofs and upon our church roofs are important, as well as providing resources to us to make our energy use more efficient, and particularly in minority communities, to allow them to provide greater energy efficiency in the use of the fossil fuels that they consume. Next slide, please. The advantages to this with regard to the three elements that Tom outlined earlier are that we can direct this and level the playing field from the vulnerable groups by directing the spending towards them. Finally, it also provides good research and development that industry won't do because new technologies have to be developed, and some industries are not going to want to invest in those particular research items that need to be performed. Next slide, please. However, there are weaknesses with regard to this approach. The first is that many, particularly mitigation strategies, do not directly remove CO2 emissions. They can be very expensive. And while we're spending the money on ourselves, and while we can direct them toward more minority communities in a socially just way, they do not affect our trading partners globally. Next slide, please. Now, the second way is by passing laws and regulation. There is no question that the Clean Air Act has been a major improvement in terms of public health. Trillions of dollars in terms of healthcare have been saved, and tens to hundreds of thousands of lives, particularly preventable death, has happened. Clearly, clean energy standards, the ones proposed by the Biden administration, can move forward with regard to treating CO2 as a pollutant, and that will also improve the healthcare profile and have dramatic healthcare benefits. Next slide, please. Again, regulations can target vulnerable populations. For example, we can tell people that are polluting near communities that they have to clean up their act. The healthcare benefits to that minority community will therefore be better. However, there are downsides. Next slide, please. And they are, it takes time to develop and implement the rules with regard to this. For example, to just get lead out of the gasoline that occurred in the 1960s required almost 10 years worth of regulation before it was effective. We don't have time for that. Regulations can be costly in attempts to provide oversight in their enforcement. And finally, they're vulnerable to changes in administration. Look at what happened to the EPA and EPA regulations under the Trump administration. And finally, those regulations do not do much with regard to our global trading partners who will have to reduce their CO2 emissions as well. Next slide, please. One way through regulation that government can work is through an emissions cap and trade system. It provides emission standards and then allows particular industries to trade amongst themselves with regard to how much carbon they can emit. While this can also be used as a way to affect a reduction in CO2 emissions, it has many drawbacks. Next slide, please. The first is that next slide, please. The first is that it's complicated to run this particular sort of system and that companies can game the system. That's particularly important because the effectiveness of cap and trade in Europe has not been as great as expected because industries were able to lobby government with regard to their own emissions and get themselves exempt from doing it. They also do not target minority communities well. Companies, particularly fossil fuel emitting companies and electric plants, can continue to pollute near frontline communities, and therefore regulation is needed in order for them to prevent doing so. And then finally, because CO2 knows no boundaries, international trade agreements that reduce emissions through use of a cap and trade system are particularly difficult to negotiate. Next slide, please. So let's have Linda contemplate the third way of how government can assist us in moving forward and away from CO2 emissions that are catastrophic in nature.
Thank you, Curtis. Another strategy is carbon fee. And this is not cap and trade, like Curtis just described, but a fee. Some call it a carbon penalty. And there are two other important pieces of this strategy, a dividend and a carbon border adjustment. We'll look at all three of these elements, starting with why a carbon fee? Several reasons. First, the price of carbon in our economy is artificially low. Not only is the petroleum industry highly subsidized, we're not paying the full cost of burning fossil fuel. The healthcare costs that Tom outlined, environmental cleanup, disaster relief, all that comes out of other pots of money, taxes, insurance costs, and these are millions of dollars every year. Putting a fee on carbon will level the playing field for other cleaner energy sources. And another reason is pretty straightforward. When something costs more, people tend to buy less of it. So as fossil fuels become more expensive, everyone, businesses and consumers, are naturally incentivized to conserve, innovate, and find cleaner choices. So here's how it works. A fee is placed on the fuel as far upstream as possible at the well or mine. The Treasury collects that fee and returns the net revenue to U.S. households in regularly scheduled dividend checks. The price increases each year, providing a very predictable and transparent framework for businesses and consumers to plan and adapt. And the dividend piece is really critical, especially for low and middle income households. There will be a gradual increase in energy costs, so the dividend provides the money needed to afford those costs and make the transition. There's a recent household impact study that showed that 90% of low income would receive more in dividend checks than they're paying in higher costs. Another important piece of this strategy is the carbon border adjustment. Because people often ask, well, what about China? What about India? Well, if we had a fee on carbon, then imported goods pay a border adjustment. Goods exported from the US receive a refund. So this does a couple of things. It reduces the incentive for the United States companies to move their dirty industries overseas. We've seen that before. It also provides an incentive for other countries to reduce emissions, so they're not having to pay that border adjustment. So it has a global impact. As Tom mentioned earlier, other countries have to be a part of the solution. So some advantages. It's socially just from the standpoint that the dividend protects the most vulnerable from those increased energy costs. It certainly doesn't address the whole range of environmental injustice issues, but it does have a very clear, transparent way to address the temporary rise in energy costs. Secondly, it's fast. It can work relatively quickly and simply. It would be simple to implement. It could be up and running within a few months. It will quickly drive down carbon emissions and start improving the air quality. And it has an economy-wide impact. The clean air standard is an important piece. The energy sector is about 27% of our economy. If we put a fee on carbon, that covers about 80% of our economy, so much broader reach. It also spurs innovation that will be needed. And with the border adjustment, it will have a global impact. Some other advantages is it reduces consumption. Tom talked about that. We need to cut back through efficiencies, et cetera. And one plus is the dividend can be structured in a variety of ways. Some proposals have 100% return to households. That's the simplest, most transparent, lowest overhead. But others suggest let's means test it and use so that mid and low income receive the dividend, but that other chunk of money can be invested in frontline communities, coal communities, infrastructure, et cetera. It also plays well with the regulations and investments that will also be necessary, those things that Curtis outlined. It has the support of many, many economists, the United Nations, business leaders, and many faith communities, including our own, PCUSA. It's definitely not the only thing we need to do, but good research suggests that it's an essential part of a climate package. And here's why. So some folks at MIT created a simulation model where we could test various hypotheses. I know this graphic looks pretty confusing, but if you look at the lower half of it, these are different scenarios that we could test. So what if we got rid of coal? What if we got rid of oil? And then how would that affect global temperature? And this is a global model. So, as we know, our target is to stay below 1.5. So if we do nothing, the model suggests we're going to be at 3.6 by 2100. So let's try some things. So one of the proposals that's been out there, well, what if we planted 1 trillion trees? So if we move the lever on afforestation, it certainly makes a difference. But obviously that item all by itself isn't going to get us where we need to go. Another thing that's getting a lot of talk is electrifying transportation. Let's build out charging stations. Let's build electric vehicles. Again, an excellent thing to do. Again, we can see it helps, but as a solo activity, it's not going to get us where we need to go. So, okay, what if we really go big? Let's look at how our energy is supplied. Let's get rid of coal, oil, natural gas. Let's maximize renewables. Let's look at advanced nuclear. And let's also look at making our energy efficiency better in transportation and in our buildings, as well as electrifying those. That gets us to 2.5, a significant progress for sure. The challenge here is that each one of these would likely require a separate piece of legislation or regulatory policy. Taking this one sector at a time is, well, we can imagine what that would be like in Washington. So what about carbon pricing? If we put a fee on carbon, just that, we get the same place, 2.5. Again, it's not 1.5, but it's a great start. And the thing about putting a fee on carbon, as we were mentioning, it also spurs other things, that it supports and accelerates other things that need to happen. It will naturally incentivize energy efficiency, electrification. It will also spur technology. If we do that and we tackle the deforestation, you can see the numbers starting to go down. And if we tackle the agricultural piece, we're at 1.4. So here are the big takeaways here. A carbon fee can quickly drive down emissions across a big chunk of our economy, and it can support and accelerate all the other things that need to happen. So that was a lot of information. We'd like to pause there for questions. What questions came up as you're listening? Looking at one question here.
I see one in the chat there, Linda, from Bob in Portola Valley.
Yes.
The reconciliation bill and the bipartisan infrastructure bill.
Yes. We will be addressing that right after the Q&A. So if you can hold that, because there are some pieces in that, but we'll talk more about that after this Q&A.
Fine.
Someone says, I'm not optimistic we can enact a carbon fee quickly. What's the impact if it takes 5 to 10 years? Well, yeah, we all read the IPCC or saw the IPCC report. We don't have 10 years. We got to do something now.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the other way I would clearly it's a big political challenge to get politicians, even those who are very much in favor of aggressive climate action, to support anything that can be labeled as a new tax. But I think it's important to remember other like we have to compare it to other things, all of which will take a long time. So building renewable energy infrastructure takes time. These are big capital projects that will take years. Whereas if we can get something like a carbon fee and dividend in place, immediately there will be some reduction in emissions. A lot of that will be on just switching from more polluting to less polluting energy, and also from conservation and behavior change. So I think it's a really valid question. But I would always say, well, compared to what, there aren't, the other solutions are not fast.
Yeah. There's another question here. Is there a separate carbon fee and dividend bill that was introduced in April? There are probably half a dozen carbon fee bills. So, and we'll take a look at some of those after this Q&A.
And let me just say one other thing is that, you know, we start where we are. And there are forces in place now that will start to abate our carbon emissions, but we need to do it much more quickly. And so if it takes 5 or 10 years, it will still have the effect of bringing those emissions down in a very rapid fashion compared to any other policy you might implement. So the answer is start tomorrow. And if tomorrow doesn't work, start 3 or 4 years from now. You know, it's going to have the same effect at that moment on carbon emissions going forward. And I do want to answer the question that Jerry posed about who has a fee and dividend. And he says Canada, and the answer is yes. And in fact, that data is important because Vancouver in British Columbia has had a carbon tax and a dividend to all their population now. And it had one in place for a considerable period of time to gather some data. And they've shown that over what the emissions would have been under their plan, enacting a tax of about $25 a ton, they have abated or avoided 20% of the emissions in their population that would have occurred over that period of time had they not enacted a tax. And since we advocate for a fee of up to $50, that feeds right into the reduction of 40 to 45% in emissions that most of the people in Citizens Climate Lobby have stated will occur if about a $50 to $55 a ton tax occurs. So
there's a question from Susan about Citizens Climate Lobby has been working on bipartisan space. Yes, that's a nonpartisan, working hard, hoping for bipartisan solutions. Absolutely. There any other? Yeah, and Canada is still building pipelines through Indigenous lands. Pipeline 3, yes.
There is one other question we haven't considered here, which is the one from Susan in Asheville. How do we convince corporations? Well, there are numerous companies that operate through a consortium called CERES, C-E-R-E-S, and many of them have pushed for a carbon price. It's interesting that even the fossil fuel companies have started to adopt this as a way forward, because it defines actually a business model that's predictable for them. And you know, I read recently where ExxonMobil's chief counsel stated, yes, we advocated for a carbon fee. Well, the reason why we did it is that it wouldn't be adopted anyway. And I found that somewhat cynical, but there are many corporations that have adopted it. And we need to encourage more of them to do so.
Yeah, I could add to that. One of the things that I've heard is corporate America doesn't need convincing. It's the trade unions, the people who write the checks for political donations. Plenty of businesses have signed on to this concept. So it's the folks in Washington. We've got to let them know that there is political will for it. Okay. Well, maybe we'll have another time for questions in a moment.
There is a question here from Rich Person who asked, some scientists say carbon capture is a diversion with only minimal impact, and others say it's absolutely essential to stay below 1.5. And the answer to that question is both speed and effectiveness. We don't have technology right now to operate carbon capture at an industrial pace, at an industrial scale. That has to be developed. But in order to remove or stay below 1.5, it's very clear that we're going to have to take carbon dioxide out of the air. So in a sense, both things are correct. One, it has minimal impact now because we don't have the way to adopt it at scale. And it is absolutely essential because we have to remove CO2 at some point from the air. The other point of this is speed. If we do something now that's very quick, Tom mentioned something called the carbon budget. If we're able to maintain ourselves below that budget, then we're a whole lot better off than if we exceed it. So I'll be quiet. Thanks. I've gotten revved up here. Thanks. Sorry.
Easy to get revved up about this stuff. It's important and it matters. Yeah. So wanted to take a couple minutes and look at what's happening right now in DC. We know there's been a lot of polarization. There are a couple of counterexamples. Curtis mentioned the Growing Climate Solutions Act. That passed the Senate in the end of June by 92-8. I mean, it's unbelievable almost that kind of bipartisan support for supporting regenerative ag. That was introduced by Senator Stabenow, a Democrat from Michigan, and Senator Mike Brown, Republican from Indiana. Another bipartisan moment was earlier this week when the Senate passed the $1 trillion infrastructure bill. It does have some climate-related investments, which are certainly important, but they're not going to get to the large-scale systemic change needed to address the urgency that we know is essential to address the climate crisis. So there are a number of broad-based climate bills. Sadly, none of these have bipartisan sponsorship. The Market Choice Act has Republican sponsors. The rest are all have Democrat sponsors. Just taking a look at this first one, the Energy Innovation Act, it has something like 80 co-sponsors in the House. And when it was first introduced in 2018, there were 3 Republicans. 2 of them retired, and the other one, when it was reintroduced, didn't re-up. So it's all Democrats at this point. But if you look at the supporters, lots of people, businesses, faith groups, hundreds of supporters for this concept of carbon fee and dividend. Our PCUSA also has a statement of support about this this piece of legislation. Another one we'd like to highlight, the Thrive Act has a few Democrat sponsors. This really, it has a lot of support among the environmental justice community. It addresses, first of all, it lays out some principles that are important in addressing the climate crisis. That first one, honoring frontline leadership. One of the huge frustrations of the environmental justice community is they've not had a voice at the table. That's beginning to change, but historically it's certainly true. So no wonder it's an issue. It should be. The bill creates a Thrive board that informs investments, and the principles say 50% of those at least must be in frontline communities. It also has very strong labor and environmental standards as a part of it. One of the carbon fee bills most recently introduced by Senators Whitehouse and Schatz is an interesting one. They worked very hard to listen to environmental justice communities as well as people in coal country and other labor groups to work to address their concerns. This bill has a very strong carbon fee. Again, as we saw, that quickly reduces emissions, but the dividend is means tested. So low and mid income households get a regular check. The rest of that revenue goes to address environmental justice and other labor concerns. The political calculation in Washington right now is that there aren't enough votes in the Senate to get climate legislation passed through regular legislative process. It takes 60 votes and they just aren't there. Okay. So the Dems are going it alone and working to get climate action in the budget through reconciliation. They launched this process earlier this week when they passed the $3.5 trillion infrastructure budget proposal on Tuesday. Right now, it includes a methane fee, a carbon border tariff, and a clean energy standard. Over the next few weeks, committees will be working on the details. They report out in mid-September, so 1 month from today, roughly. So what's happening is many organizations are busy calling senators advocating for the principles they believe will solve the climate crisis. So in DC parlance, the sausage making has begun, and now is really the time for us to speak up. Curtis?
Thank you, Linda. And let's consider now how we can speak up and what we can do, and what we can do and what our denomination has done and is doing. Next slide, please. So let's first consider what PCUSA's position has been in the past, both regard to climate change and with regard to the particular thing that we've been discussing for the last 30 minutes or so. Next slide, please. Now, it's not my intention to note that our church and our denomination has been a powerful advocate, telling all of us, both as individuals and churches as groups, to advocate for the environment and for the good of creation. It has passed items in the past through overtures and through policy statements through the General Assembly advocating for this. In 2018, the last time that there was an in-person General Assembly, there were two significant policies that were passed. The first that stated that the earth belongs to the Lord and that we've been given stewardship of it, and that we as a whole church need to raise a voice with regard to the urgency that climate change is disaffecting it, and to remember that the future of all life depends upon how we treat it. There is not a place, and there is not another God-given place we can go. Next slide, please. It also said in support of that a carbon price with appropriate way that does not disadvantage vulnerable populations was an important policy that should be advocated for. Next slide, please. And so, in support of a carbon price and in support of a dividend, the Office of Public Witness put to its website that it is essential to, when we deal with the planet crisis that we have, that we deal with the most vulnerable people living on it by not disadvantaging them economically through a carbon price, and that a dividend was an essential part of that. And accordingly, next slide, please, it put on a way that we could advocate through the Office of Public Witness, a means of doing so in which we could directly write our senators and representatives through that website. It in 2018 posted this as a web page on the Office of Public Witness website, and they have recently re-updated it, as we'll see in just a minute. Next slide, please. The Office of Public Witness also said that it applauds this bipartisan effort to care for suffering creation and supports the passage of this bill, and says that at the bottom of the web page that I just showed you. Next slide, please. This is the new update that's been posted to the Office of Public Witness website. And if you all have a moment and a QR reader on your phone and your cell phone immediately available, you can scan the QR code in the lower right-hand corner of this slide. And since we're going to make these slides available, you might wait for that as well. And this will take you directly to that particular endorsement. Next slide, please. We can also encourage you to add your name to a letter that the Presbyterians for Carbon Dividends has drafted in partnership with Presbyterians for Earth Care. This particular letter is given to all liaisons from Citizens Climate Lobby and is presented to the particular representative or senator that liaison is speaking to, showing our church's position with regard to this particular important endeavor. Again, if you have your phone available, you can scan the QR code or you can wait for the slides. Next slide, please. The third thing that you can do is call or write. And calling is particularly easy to do. And what we'd like to show you now, next slide, please, is this particular video from a pastor from a PCUSA church in Colorado that during his Earth Day service called his congressman. And Linda, if you could get this started, we'll play it for the next 5 or 6 minutes.
Okay, and I just did a timeout because, apologize for that. I don't think when I did this, I shared screen. No, I did not. I did not share sound. So now it will work. Okay, here we go.
Now, we can't gather to rally in person as they did on that first Earth Day, as often happens on Earth Day. But we can be activists from home. Yes, even during a global pandemic, we can activate and flood our representatives, flood our officials with phone calls, with letters perhaps. And we can encourage them, we can jar them in some cases when they need a little bit of jarring, into action. We can manifest God's love for creation by extending that love to those who have decision-making power. So this is amazingly easy to do, and I'm going to show you, all right? We're gonna have a little demonstration. You probably have one of these devices. You might even be looking at it now to view this. But it is surprisingly easy to call your elected representatives, and if they already support climate action, you can thank them and tell them keep it up. They need to know that they are encouraged and supported by their constituents. And if they don't, you can, again, thank them for their work and say, I'm calling to urge you, to encourage you. This is important to me. So in particular, I am going to make a phone call this morning about the U.S. House Resolution 763. Basically, it's this amazing piece of legislation that's pending that would impose a fee on creators of fuel, creators and importers, and then it would take that money that's generated and pay it out as a dividend to families in the U.S. and legal residents. So it's kind of a win-win, right? Help creation, help families. All right, so my representative is Betty McCollum. Pro tip, you can save your representative's number, your senator's number in your phone for easy calling. That way you don't have to look it up. But I'm going to show you just how easy this is. And if you call on the weekend, like we're going to do, we're probably just going to get a voicemail. If you call after hours, you can get a voicemail and just do that if that's easier. If you call during the week, you get to talk to an amazing intern or staff person for these folks. So I'm dialing now. I'll put it on speakerphone.
Thank you for calling the office of Congresswoman Betty McCollum, representing Minnesota's 4th Congressional District. No one is currently available to take your call. If you would like to leave a message for a staff member.
Oh, no.
Gosh.
Well, apologize for that. Not sure what's happening. Oh. Well, I don't know what else to do except send everyone the link and you can watch it another time because it is truly, it's so well done. I could try it one more time and see if it.
I think
Now we can't gather.
No, it's not working right.
oh well.
Hyphen.
That's disappointing.
We can put the link in the chat here. I'll be able to get that out and put it in, Linda. And I think and Susan Preston from Nashville has asked us to provide a list of the carbon bills in the Senate, and it might be better just to and just give her the link that we have to that, and I can do that as well here in a minute. Okay.
Yeah. What's beautiful is when he talks with his representative, it's prayerful. It's just so beautiful how he advocates for creation as he's advocating to do something policy-wise. It's really powerful. So we'll send a link.
Okay. If you could get to the, next slide, please. I think what we'll do is just ask Tom to to advocate for, or tell us the other policies we need to advocate for, because we've said there has to be some that are complementary to the ones that we've been espousing here for the last 3/4 of an hour. Thanks, Tom.
Right. Thanks, Curtis. Let me just turn my air conditioning off. It's a little noisy here in the city, so I have to keep my windows closed. Now, if you're like me and you believe in carbon fee and dividend as being a good and fair policy, but you also believe that it doesn't solve many of the problems of environmental injustice and social and economic injustice, what I would encourage you to do is to research other policies related to how we use and pay for energy that have big effects on health and equity. So here's a few of my favorites. Linda, could you advance this slide? So transportation is a really important area. It's about 1/3 of US greenhouse gas emissions come from transportation, and the majority of that is from cars and what are called light trucks, SUVs, and pickup trucks, which are generally used as passenger vehicles. The cost burden of transportation it's the largest household expense on average after housing. And if you're in the lowest, households in the lowest quintile of income pay nearly 1/3 of their income for transportation, and that goes up further in rural households. It's also hard for many of us who take access to a car for granted that there are many people in our country that do not have even a single automobile, and that includes 14% of households led by people of color versus 6% of white households. In that context, transportation spending, zoning in many communities, and greenhouse gas mitigation subsidies for transportation are generally unfair to low-income, non-car owning households. And also the way we spend on transportation and build our communities make it difficult for these same households to get access to services and economic opportunity. Next slide, please. So in addition to being unfair, one result of the way we've been doing transportation policy is that even though like public transit is very safe per mile, motor vehicles have gotten increasingly safer for the occupants, but our streets are often designed to move vehicles quickly, and our vehicles have actually gotten larger and more dangerous for pedestrians. So there's been, to me, a shocking and really a disgraceful increase in pedestrian deaths in our country, far greater risk than in any of our high-income country peers. And the burden of these deaths is not shared equally. They're much more common among people of color who are less likely to have access to an automobile. And as I mentioned earlier, air pollution from transportation also impacts low-income populations more than more affluent people. Next slide. So here are just a couple of transportation policies that, in my view, will advance just climate action, health, and safety in ways that carbon fee and dividend will not do. Next slide. One is called the Smart Zero Emission Vehicle Policy for All, or CHARGE. It's been developed by a coalition of public transportation, environmental, and environmental justice organizations. And it proposes that we first prioritize electrifying public transit. That includes public transit buses, school buses. We also strengthen our charging infrastructure in ways that is not just for automobiles, but also allows for charging of different types of vehicles, including like micromobility, electric bikes, and scooters. And then very important is that trucks, especially delivery trucks that operate where a lot of people live in urban areas, are a big source of air pollution. And so supporting transition to zero emission trucks is another way that we can put health and equity first as we spend on infrastructure for charging electric vehicles. And I will also just note, by contrast, most of the subsidies for purchase of battery electric vehicles have gone to relatively wealthy communities and households in this country so far. Next slide. Another policy that has been in place since the 1980s that you can advocate to undo is an 80-20 funding bias toward highway construction versus public transit. So I think it's important to remember that at the same time that we want to see fossil fuel production and transmission shut down, that the new highway lanes that we're building are actually going to be mainly used by automobiles that are using fossil fuels. So if we want to really decarbonize the transportation sector, we need to have more of a fair formula that gives a fair shake to public transit, which is really the greenest way and the most equitable way to move people around. Next slide. So just wrapping up, we started out by acknowledging that we have a complex problem with no single or simple fix, and that includes the problem of climate change and also how our economic system has been unfair to many people in the country. So solutions, whatever they are, whatever package of solutions there are, they have to include measures that are socially just, as we've discussed, that are fast and evidence-based, and also that work at a global level. So thank you. I think we've run a little over time, but hopefully we have a little more time for questions. Do we have more time for questions?
We do have a few minutes, I think. Are there more questions here?
I have my hand up.
Okay, Jerry, you go.
I forget what it was. I think it was, does the Montreal Protocol for ozone depletion 20 years ago serve as a model, a successful model for what you're proposing here?
I think it's not, the Montreal Protocol is not entirely an analogous situation. It concerned a very specific technology, cooling technology, refrigerants, and phasing out the most harmful refrigerants with an agreement to how quickly to do that. So in a way, it's not that it wasn't easy. It was very effective, but I think it's a less energy use, energy production and energy use. It's much more pervasive in our whole system, our whole way of life. So I think it's more of a regulatory approach that should be part of the solution, but I don't think it really replaces the carbon fee and dividend.
Okay, I just have a request that you put the link to Presbyterians or Fee and Dividend in the chat, because that's a new organization to me. I know several people that belong to the Citizens Climate Lobby, which is the national organization which has local chapters, but not one specifically for PCUSA.
Well, full disclosure, the Presbyterians for Carbon Dividends, a lot of the same people are in both there's a Presbyterian action team within Citizens Climate Lobby.
Oh,
Well, that's news to me. Do they have the separate website or anything?
No, what there should be, we're looking for space on PEC has been, as they're redoing their website, they're going to have links to the Presbyterians for Carbon Dividend. But the last I looked, it wasn't on there yet.
See, if we can tell our pastors that there's a Presbyterian entity that's in favor of this, that might help influence them to talk about it and support it.
Jerry, we have an action team. If you go to the Citizens Climate Lobby website and look under faith-based organizations, there is a Presbyterian action team, and Tom, Linda, and I think Carol Dunn from Indiana is on this in this session as well. We're all members of it.
Yeah.
And that would be one way to do it. And what Linda's talking about is essentially are the same people Presbyterians for Earth Care is going to provide a link to that, to something that's very similar to it. But there is an action team on the Citizens Climate Lobby website at the moment.
Okay, but if I wanted to send this information to my pastor, I need a link, I think.
Okay.
And I just put, someone asked for links or the information, the list of the different bills that are in play now. So I just put those in the chat. And we will send that, that'll be part of the slides and the notes too.
Okay, good.
Looks like we might be getting booted out. Susan, do you have?
I thought it was a great presentation. I'd love to be in touch by email. And I think I'm just, we're going to be going, 90 seconds. I'm all for nonpartisan and bipartisan work, unifying work. So it would be very interesting if there was an effort to break that all Democratic problem and make sure that some Presbyterian churches work with Republicans to get them back on. That would be quite a fascinating endeavor.
Exactly.
So we'd love to get in touch with you. I don't know if we can get your emails.
Tom and I just put we all three just put our emails in.
There they are. Thank you so much.
Okay. All right. Any other questions? Thank you, everyone, so much.
Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
For being here. And yeah, the more we can make this bipartisan, the stronger the staying power.